Hello, in this video we're going to be talking about user tests and writing user test reports. I'll be covering some of the information in Anderson Chapter 18, but I am only talking about what is relevant to the assignment you're going to be working on. This is in the format of basically the steps you're going to need to complete this assignment. There is a lot of information in Chapter 18 of Anderson that I am not going to be covering. So in order to really write up a good user test and in order to take your reading quiz, you're going to need to make sure that you sit down and actually read that chapter, because I'm not going to be covering everything. And we're also going to be covering some of the information from the chapter on empirical reports, because that's the format your user test takes. If you forget what memo format looks like, you also want to go back and check Anderson. So what is a user test? In a user test, you have test readers use your draft as your intended readers are going to use it so that you can get feedback that's going to help you improve your draft. And that feedback can be measurable criteria. You can be looking for some sort of quantitative benchmark. Subjects should be able to perform 90% of the steps with little or no difficulty. Subjects should be able to answer an understandability test with 85% accuracy. And if you were performing a user test for instructions for a company you were working for, that might be something you really wanted to do. You could also, and likely for our purposes, you can use subjective criteria like observation, where did subjects seem to have trouble, or interviews asking people what steps did you have difficulty with, but either one is fine. So the first thing you're going to do when you're getting ready to perform a user test is to list your objectives. What do you hope to accomplish with your test? For your instructions, what you want is to improve your draft. Think about what specific parts of your communication you want to improve. Some areas for your instructions to consider might be your graphics, usefulness, persuasiveness, the format. So you need to think about what are the specific areas that you think are most in need of improvement, and you can kind of gear, especially your interview questions, toward those. Then you're going to design your test. And there's mainly two. You can also perform a location test where you see how quickly a person can locate information. I would say that would be more relevant if you were writing a large set of instructions. You know, like when you buy a alarm clock or something and it has instructions for how to do a bunch of different things, and you might want to see, well, how quickly can someone find out how to set the time just by looking at this. But your instructions are probably not going to be for something figuring out kind of a multi-function item. So instead, a performance test or an understandability test would be the main kind. In a performance test, you have test readers actually use the instructions just like your intended readers would by actually performing the task the instructions explain while you observe them as unobtrusively as you possibly can. So you'll have the task, which is what is in the instructions, a location for a performance test, which should be at the same as or as close to the setting the intended readers will be in, and they'll need resources, which should be what the intended reader will have access to and nothing more. In an understandability test, test readers will read your instructions and then actually take a test to determine how well they understand them. You want to use open-ended and paraphrase questions rather than multiple choice or true-false questions. And the reason for that, and we might get into this in a later slide, tends to be that if someone is familiar with a task, they may be able, or even if they're not, if they're just a good test taker, they might be able to perform very well on a multiple choice or true-false test, even if your instructions aren't very good. So you're not necessarily going to get, if you ask them, let's say, even though you're not, because I don't want any instructions about changing tires on a car, and I'm sure it's covered on WikiHow, but let's say you were writing instructions about changing a tire on a car and you gave someone a multiple choice test that asked them questions about the steps. Well, obviously, if that person was familiar with changing the tire on a car, they would be able to answer the questions correctly, even if your draft wasn't very helpful in helping them to do that. So asking them to paraphrase something that you had written, asking open-ended questions is much more helpful. in both cases, and I would also say if you're running an understandability test, You generally want to use people who are not familiar with the task because, again, you don't want a person's familiarity with the subject to be what your instrument tests rather than actually testing the usefulness of your draft. And in both cases, you'll want to follow up with an open-ended interview to ask the person about their experience of using the instructions and allowing them time to tell you how you can improve your draft. Next, you're going to want to select your test readers. And your test readers should be as representative of your intended readers as you can manage. Unrepresentative test readers can actually make your test less useful. Let's say you're doing instructions about how to perform some sort of computer-related tasks, and all of your test readers are your fellow senior comp sci majors. That might actually lead you to revise your draft in a way that would not help the average novice user, because your test readers might say, oh, no, there's too much information here. I didn't need these steps, and you could take that out, and actually a beginner might not be able to know that. So it's useful to have test readers of different levels, but if you're going to err, I'd say err on the side of having people less familiar with the task. For this user test, you want 2 to 4 test readers. More is better, but you obviously need to be mindful of time constraints. You're not going to be able to line up 10. I would say you want at a minimum 2, 3 would be great. Let your test readers know what they'll be doing. Tell them that you want constructive feedback. Treat them respectfully. And try to make sure that your user test isn't going to take too long, as we say in the instructions for this, about 15 minutes. You don't want to run a test that's too long. And then you'll actually perform your user tests. Whether it's a performance or understandability test, you want to be as unobtrusive and quiet as possible. For a performance test, take notes on what you observe. And if you have things in mind you're looking for, where they're having trouble, any comments they make, steps that take a very long time, steps they move through really quickly, how often they look back at the page. If you have specific things you want to note, that will make your notes more useful for you. Do not intervene unless the test reader absolutely cannot move on to the next step. Give them some time to see if they can figure it out. If they really can't, if they're stuck, then you can step in, provide only enough help to let them move forward, and then go back to being an observer. I would recommend, if at all possible, choosing a task that allows for a performance test. However, you can get a good result from an understandability test if it is well designed. And again, a true, false, or multiple choice question test about the task is often going to do a better job measuring the user's knowledge of the task than of your instructions. So you'll want to keep that in mind. Then you're going to want to interpret your results. And you're going to consider questions like, how many subjects did you have? So how broadly can your observations be generalized? What differences are there between your test readers and your intended readers? And what should you do with that information? And what did you observe that might help you to interpret the result? Did your test readers seem nervous or rushed? Were they distracted? Was there an issue with the equipment or a problem of some kind? So you can, and if not, if they just struggled at a step, you're really going to want to ask yourself, well, what was going on here? What were the specific problems that they had? And then you're going to actually draft your user test report memo. And it's going to have the following sections: an introduction, where you give a general overview of your tests and task. And it can be very helpful here to give a brief overview of the actual results. So to preview what's going to be in your conclusion and recommendations, to preview your results. You're going to want an objective section where you list the objectives of your test, be as specific as possible. You'll have a method section where you explain your testing methods. You'll want to indicate whether it's a performance or an understandability test. Talk about the tasks done, what you're looking for, the questions you asked, and describe your selection of test readers. A results section where you present the results of your test in as much useful detail as you can, and if you can, a graphical representation of your results of some type. It could be a chart or a graph of how many people struggled at each step, or what steps people had the most trouble with, or it could be, as we saw, just a table where you put in some of what you observed or what you were told. A discussion section where you interpret your results in a general way and consider any reasons why you got the results you did. And then a recommendation section where you recommend concrete changes to the draft. These are actions that are going to be taken to revise the draft. So you want that section to be concise, clearly organized, and often a numbered or bulleted list would be a really useful way to write up that section. So I hope that this was helpful and you're a little maybe less confused about this assignment after watching these 3 videos. If you still have any questions about the user test memo, again, pop over to the discussion board. The sub forum about asking questions would be wonderful because I can answer them there. And a lot of times if students ask me useful questions there, I will include them in my next announcement. I'll also answer the questions, so that lets me know the kind of things that you all might need to know. Or you can send me an email. You can contact me during office hours and let me know what issues you're having. Okay, everyone have a good week.